Hi, everyone. Welcome for a special edition of Baden Hill Academy. And this is the Postcolonialism Unit's Word Bag. So we're going to go through as quickly as we can. I just want to give you some support as you're trying to learn this plethora of terms. By the way, plethora means a whole lot. So here we go. Number one, Andrew Jackson. I'm not going to say the number every time, but here we go. Andrew Jackson, a president who is known, first of all, as a war hero during the War of 1812. When he became president, he championed the spoils system, which meant that the victor, the winner, got the spoils, which means the treasures, and that meant that they got to hire their friends to be in their government, and that led to a lot of corruption. Andrew Jackson is also known for his Trail of Tears. And he was the one who declared that tribes in the southeast of the United States had to move to Oklahoma and give up their territory. William Bradford. William Bradford was the head of Plymouth Plantation, the Plymouth colony. Remember Plymouth Rock? He's also at the center of the story of Thanksgiving because he is the one who wrote down the account of Massasoit and Squanto and that first Thanksgiving. Unfortunately, from that story of good news, comes the tale of King Philip's War, and King Philip was the son of Massasoit. And so 50 years after Thanksgiving happened, the colonists and the Native Americans were in a bloody war, and it was the bloodiest, deadliest war per capita in U.S. history. Pocahontas. We know Pocahontas because she was the daughter of Powhatan, and got to know John Smith and saved John Smith's life, but that wasn't who she ended up marrying. She married John Rolfe, who was also a colonist, and John Rolfe then brought tobacco to the United States, unfortunately changed the world and world history forever. But because of that marriage between a Native American and an English colonist, we can see that there was the intention to coexist and live together. And many of the people in Virginia at that time had mixed ancestry. John Rolfe then is her husband. The 5 tribes that are listed, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, are the 5 civilized tribes. They dressed in European or American clothing, and they had learned English, and yet they were still forced to move by Andrew Jackson, President Jackson's declaration and the Trail of Tears. George Custer. George Custer was a U.S. general, and General Custer basically led the U.S. Army against the Native Americans, notably the Lakota Sioux, and he was killed in Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. But on the other side was Black Elk, and Black Elk is again one of the Sioux who fought against Custer, and is very well known for his eloquence, his words about that war. And we need to know the Apache. That's number 10. Apache are another group that were fighting in the Southwest, fighting then kind of cross-border battles against Mexican colonists or settlers and U.S. settlers. And Geronimo is the most famous from those battles. Even though he was fighting against the U.S., he was held in great reverence and respect by most Americans. But Teddy Roosevelt was very derogatory toward Native Americans, and basically he told Geronimo that he was going to wait and see if the Native Americans would behave. And so again, he led U.S. colonization in places like the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and this is important to understand Teddy Roosevelt's role. The Comanche were Native Americans in Texas and were known for their fierceness and the difficulty that Texans had in fighting them. And the Texas Rangers finally got Colt revolvers, which was a new invention, and they were able to overcome the Comanche. The Pueblo, Anasazi, and Navajo are basically Southwest Indians, and if you know the Four Corners area, where the four corners of 4 states meet, that's a location where they lived. And Mesa Verde is another one where there are cliff dwellings again, from these Anasazi, and just know that that was a group of people in a specific culture, and they were invaded by colonists and settlers from the United States, colonists who became colonizers. And we have Denis Kearney. Denis Kearney was an Irish American, and he spoke out against Chinese immigrants. And so even though he came from an immigrant family, he was very, very loud in his attacks on Chinese immigrants. And he would be called a demagogue, somebody who just shoots their mouth off about groups of people and gets people riled up. Abolitionists were against slavery. William McKinley is known for his Manifest Destiny policy. This is something that the Americans have been doing, and he basically saw this as an act of God when the United States got into war with Spain and was able to take territories from Spain. He saw it as a way for the United States to expand its influence. Basically, again, someone who had been colonized, the United States, became a colonizer. Emilio Aguinaldo was a Filipino insurgent, someone who fought against the Spanish and then the United States as well. And there was a years-long insurrection, and hundreds of thousands of Filipinos ended up dying in that insurrection. The Big Four. We need to know here in San Francisco who these Big Four were. Crocker, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins were all involved in building the Central Pacific Railroad out to meet the Union Pacific Railroad and the golden spike that was hammered in at Promontory Point, Utah. Celebrated this transcontinental railroad. But you need to know that these four wouldn't have gotten together to do this if it hadn't been for Theodore Judah, and Judah Street is named for him. He was someone who worked with the railroads and got these four involved. Crocker's army is all the Chinese workers who worked for the Central Pacific Railroad. And Sun Yat-sen, again, revolutionary in Qing Dynasty, China, and basically led the country toward revolution in 1911. He was actually in Denver at the time the revolution finally happened, the Wuchang uprising. But he is considered the father of the country, the George Washington of the country, and he was Hawaiian. His family had come to Hawaii, still Chinese. They weren't Americans, but we can see him as a forerunner of Chinese Americans and someone who definitely deserves credit on our side of the Pacific. Father Coughlin is someone who was a demagogue like Denis Kearney, who spoke on the radio. He was an Irish priest, but he was a fascist. He supported anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish talking. And so he was very powerful, had a strong following, and it's something that we should see as something we must avoid in our country and denounce. Lord Mountbatten is involved in two parts of our unit, right? He was in our India section because he was the last viceroy of India. But before that, and that was right at the partition time, but before that he was in Vietnam, in South Vietnam, with the British when they came to replace the Japanese and kind of restore order in South Vietnam. Then we have Sardar Patel, who was an Indian lawmaker, a member of the Indian National Congress. He was Hindu, but he understood that India needed to be divided. At least he accepted that partition. Gandhi, again, fought against the partition, and the two were in conflict, and Gandhi finally left politics and sadly was assassinated later. But, Sardar Patel said it's better for one breakup than many breakups. Jinnah, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, was the first. He started the Muslim League, and then he became the first leader of Pakistan. The Uyghurs in China are an ethnic group that they're Muslim. They're different from the Han Chinese. They're in the western part of China, and today they are put in internment camps very often just because of their difference from the rest of the Chinese people. And, under the auspices of terrorism, as if they are somehow suspects. It's very much like internment of Japanese during World War II. Mao Zedong was the communist leader in China, again, against someone like Chiang Kai-Shek, who was, they were basically vying for power over China. But Mao Zedong was a communist and led the communists against Chiang Kai-shek and eventually became the leader of the country. Zhou Enlai had been with the KMT, and had been with Chiang Kai-shek, but became a communist and was one of the first leaders of the People's Republic of China as well. Now, Chiang Kai-shek, we could say so much about him, but just know his nickname was Generalissimo. He was the big general. He was a dictator, and he started as a president of the KMT, but eventually he consolidated his rule. He got rid of all the other rivals, and he became the dictator. He was the commandant of the Whampoa Academy, and Zhou Enlai and Ho Chi Minh, they were at that same academy. Ho Chi Minh then was in Canton in Guangzhou for a time at the Huangpu or Whampoa Academy, and so he taught there. He taught classes on socialism, but he became the father of modern Vietnam. Archimedes Patty was an OSS, which was the precursor to CIA. He was an officer who came to Vietnam, trying to work with rebels there against the Japanese during World War II. And what happened is, Ho Chi Minh was sick, and Patty's doctor helped heal Ho Chi Minh. Phan Boi Chau was a revolutionary in Vietnam, wanted nationalism to take root in Vietnam. He wanted a nation for the Vietnamese people, free from French rule. And so he was kind of one of the precursors, one of the first revolutionaries, and he was sent into exile many times. And eventually he was betrayed by Ho Chi Minh. And that's a long story, but just know there is a relationship between that old revolutionary way and the new way. Harry S. Truman became president when FDR died during World War II, before the end of World War II. And he, gave the orders for the dropping of the atomic bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima and Nagasaki in that order. And he also basically rejected Ho Chi Minh's request for intervention against the French so that the French wouldn't come back to their colony. And even though FDR had been very suspicious of the French, remember the French, there was a lot of socialism, almost communism happening in France. And Charles de Gaulle, the general there, didn't really want to be pressured by the United States. So there was a lot of chess playing going on, and Truman made that move, and it changed history. Douglas MacArthur also made a chess move that changed history. He demanded that the Japanese surrender to him personally on board the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. But that meant a delay, because for him to get there, he had to wait out a typhoon. And in that meantime, the Viet Minh, the communist Viet Minh, basically walked into the vacuum and created a situation where there would be a long, long war. Bao Dai was the emperor of Vietnam, supported by the French at the end, okay? In South Vietnam, North Vietnam had become communist and was controlled by Ho Chi Minh and his government. And Bao Dai was still the last of the Wen emperors, and he was emperor, but basically he was a puppet leader. And that was the end of any sort of royal family. General Giap fought at the Battle of Hanoi, and he also he was the leader at the Battle of Hanoi, and then led the Vietnamese basically through the Vietnam War, what we call the Vietnam War. It was actually the Second Indochina War. Ngo Dinh Diem is very important because he became a dictator in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. He was elected, but like by 98%, and as a result, we knew that the election was tainted. He got rid of Bao Dai's government and became a dictator, and he was the one that we were working with, the United States was working with throughout the war. Yomo Kenyatta, we're in Africa now, and Yomo Kenyatta was a leader during the Mau Mau uprising and was put in prison and then eventually was freed. He promoted reconciliation between white and black Kenyans, and he became president, but he was also a dictator as well. The Afrikaners were basically the Africans of Dutch descent in South Africa and in the Cape Colony. And, after the Dutch lost their power to the British, they had to move inland in the Great Trek So Afrikaners, you need to know. William Wilberforce, great movie, Amazing Grace, about his life and how he tried to get rid of slavery throughout the British Empire. And so his influence is felt all over the world. Bob Geldof was a great man who just was a rock and roll musician, and he promoted the idea of support for Ethiopia during the famine of 1983 to 1985. And so he should be known. Idi Amin was a dictator in Uganda and was guilty of terrible atrocities there over the 1970s. Muammar Gaddafi was in Libya, also a dictator, and only was, in the last 10 years was he gotten rid of by his own people in another civil war, basically. Hissène Habré was a dictator in Chad that was installed basically by the CIA and the US government, and 40,000 people died as a result of his dictatorship. Leopold II was the king of Belgium and had his own personal colony in Congo. And, that would become the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zaire and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's a terrible story of abuse that has continued to this day. Mobutu Sese Seko, Patrice Lumumba is one name to know, and he became the prime minister during the time of freedom and independence for Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, but eventually he invited the Soviets to come in and help, and that led to the Congo Crisis. Eventually, Mobutu Sese Seko, who is Joseph Desiré Mobutu, he was the general and basically captured Lumumba, and he was executed, and Mobutu became a dictator for decades. And again, just terrible abuses during his time as dictator in Congo. Samuel Ajayi Crowther was the first Anglican bishop, first black Anglican bishop from Africa. Places include Plymouth Rock. We've already discussed William Bradford, the Pilgrims at Plymouth Rock in 1620. The Black Hills, where Custer fought against the Sioux. The Philippines, Cuba, Panama, Guam, Puerto Rico, after the Spanish-American War, those places were basically annexed. Cuba and Philippines eventually would get their freedom again, but they were influenced by American policy and American colonialism. Guantanamo Bay is a leftover from that war because the United States still has a military base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. Even though Cuba is a communist nation and has been very hostile to the United States, we still have our base there, and it's become a political prison as well. Number 55. Promontory Point, Utah is where the Golden Spike was hammered in for the Transcontinental Railroad. Pakistan, again, was after partition in 1947. Pakistan was the western part and India the eastern part, and then eventually East Pakistan became Bangladesh. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the locations of the first atomic bombs, dropped in August of 1945. Bengal and Punjab, they were two provinces that were divided up because of the partition in 1947 in India. And there was great unrest because, again, Hindus had to move to their portion and Muslims had to move to their portion. The Deccan Plateau is also the Deccan Peninsula. It's the bottom part of India, but the interior part is a big plateau, and that's geography. Himalayas, you should know as a central point where, again, the waters flow into the Indus River. You have the Himalayas, and you also have the Hindu Kush Mountains. So the Hindu Kush Mountains and the Himalayas, they drain into those two rivers, the Indus River and the Ganges River. And Islamabad is a very new city in Pakistan, capital of Pakistan. New Delhi is the capital of India. Bangladesh in the eastern portion. Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan, and Dhaka is the capital of that country. Karachi and Lahore are also cities in Pakistan that are major cities. Burma and Myanmar, again, was part of India but broke away It has been a scene of a military dictatorship, and now there's a transition, but there's basically ethnic conflicts that are happening in Burma. I think we're going to go back to calling it Burma instead of Myanmar. Sri Lanka, which was previously Ceylon, is that island off of the east of India, and they have had civil war and unrest there as well. The capital is Colombo. That's number 72. You need to know that in the west of India, you have Mumbai, which was earlier called Bombay. In the east, you have Kolkata, which used to be Calcutta. You have Madras, which again, Chennai is what you will find today in Madras. These are all cities in India, so just know both names. Goa on the west coast of India is a Portuguese colony. Remember when the Portuguese established colonies all over India to have their trade with the East Indies? Goa was Portuguese India, and it became India, part of India. Kashmir is a disputed territory between Pakistan and India, even today. Shifting to China, the Taihang Mountains. Again, we talk about Shandong and Shanxi, and it's basically east of the mountains and west of the mountains, and those are the mountains. And you have Hebei and Henan, and that's the Yellow River, north of the Yellow River and south of the Yellow River in China. Xi'an is fairly close to Beijing. It was the capital for the Mongols. Kublai Khan, the capital during I spoke incorrectly. Beijing was the capital for the Mongols, and Xi'an was the capital for the Qin dynasty. That's where China gets its name. Qin Shi Huangdi, remember the first emperor. So Beijing was the capital of the Mongol Empire and has become the capital today. Shanghai is it's on the ocean. Okay, so just know Shanghai means the sea. Nanjing is close to that, and that means southern capital. So you have Beijing, that's the northern capital. Nanjing is the southern capital. You have Guangdong and Guangzhou. And Guangdong, you can hear maybe Canton is similar to Guangdong, but Guangdong is the province and Guangzhou is the city of Canton. Hong Kong is in South China again, and is part of that area of Guangdong. And so Cantonese is spoken in Hong Kong. Taiwan then is off the coast. It's in the south and it's across from Fujian province. Taiwan though is today the Republic of China. It's not a part of China, even though China still says it is. It has its own president, own government, and they haven't been invaded by China yet. Part of the Cold War and a part of Chiang Kai-Shek taking his government and going to Taiwan. Mongolia is a buffer between Russia and China, and it's also, Inner Mongolia is a province, the northernmost province or one of the northern provinces of China. Okay, about halfway through. Nanjing, we've already talked about as the southern capital, and I'm backing up. Qingdao. Okay, Qingdao is on the coast, on the eastern coast, and it's used to be a German colony, and that's why beer was made there, and that's why Qingdao is a beer. Tsingtao, if you've ever seen that. And again, beer is something far in your future. Okay, Manchuria is in the northeast, and if I get that wrong, you can understand I'm flipping around the video. And so Manchuria is where the Qing dynasty came from. It's also where the Japanese landed and they took over in the Manchurian Incident, causing, an explosion, and then saying terrorists were responsible and sending in their troops in 1931. And so World War II started a lot earlier than we usually think of. Hanoi is, again, it's in the north of Vietnam, and Hanoi, the Battle of Hanoi was General Giap fought that. It was basically the first battle of the first Indochina War, and controlled by North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, what we know as the Vietnam War. Congo is a name we use both for French Congo and Belgian Congo, and just know that it's an area with the Congo River, Central Africa, and the rainforest area. Zaire then is the Belgian Congo, became Democratic Republic of Congo. That's 93. Republic of Congo today is French Congo, basically. So just know that they are not the same country. And Republic of Congo has actually been used by both sides, so it gets very confusing. Ethiopia is the location where there were many Christians in that country. And so there's an interesting relationship between Europe and that country. But just know that recently there's been famine, and that's why there was the famine relief in 1985, especially 1984, 1985. Cape Colony in the south, again, started all the way back to the Portuguese and the Dutch, but the Dutch get most of the credit because of the Afrikaners that developed their language, Afrikaans there, and also the policy of apartheid in the 1940s. Eswatini is what Swaziland is called today, and that is an important country just because it's in the middle of South Africa, this tiny country in the middle of South Africa, and it's also a place where AIDS has ravaged the population, the adult population. There are so many orphans in that country as a result. Rwanda was the site of a terrible massacre between the majority Hutus and the minority Tutsis. And the Tutsis did some genocide, and so did the Hutus, but the Hutus, mainly in 1994, were guilty of just this incredible massacre of Tutsis. And finally, that was resolved. Still today, there's conflict and tension. Nigeria, remember all their resources, and remember that there was a terrible civil war, and there's Muslims in the north and Christians in the south, along with other, indigenous Africans that have their own religion, which is animism, we'll call that. Kenya, then, is, again, it's where there was a revolution against British rule, and things changed. Nigeria had British rule as well. Kenya had a kind of a more peaceful transition in some ways, and again, Kenyatta then became a dictator, unfortunately. Things. 101. The Treaty of Paris that's a name we use for a lot of things. Just know it was the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War. It was also the end of the Revolutionary War. And I think it was even the end of the Vietnam conflict. I have to check on that. I think it's Treaty of Paris as well. The Articles of Confederation refer to the first government of the United States after the Revolutionary War, and they didn't work very well because they didn't have a strong federal government. It led to the Constitutional Convention, where they developed the Constitution in 1787. Bicameral legislature means two houses. Camera doesn't mean camera, it means house or room, chamber. That's chamber camera, you can see the root. And so bicameral legislature is what we have in the United States. We have an upper house, which is the Senate, lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and they have different representation. The three sisters are three plants, bean, squash, and corn. Bean, squash, and corn that were raised by many of the Native American groups. It was a big part of Native American culture. Last of the Mohicans is a book written by James Fenimore Cooper, and it just gives you the understanding of Mohicans were one of these Native American groups, the Iroquois, that were being threatened by these conflicts of the colonists and the colonization. And even though he didn't write it as totally sympathetic to these Native Americans, maybe it was forward thinking in some ways, realizing that this conflict was involving all different groups of people. Trail of Tears refers to Andrew Jackson's declaration and the migration then of all those tribes from the southeast of the United States to Oklahoma. And many died along the way. Socialism is not communism, but socialism is it's a kind of government that has influenced Europe profoundly, because many governments are social democrat governments. And it means that the government has a strong say in how economics works. But generally, it's still capitalism with a lot of government taxes and things like that. Okay, free states versus slave states in the United States, that meant basically the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the territories, the Kansas Territory, and the fact that Kansas and Nebraska were ready to enter the Union because of settlement. But because the United States was divided in North and South, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, it was a big battle to see whether they would be free or slave. And eventually the idea of popular sovereignty came to be the policy, that those areas could decide for themselves whether they wanted to be slave or free. The Wilmot Proviso, we didn't mean to skip it, but that was a part of the Mexican-American War, not the Spanish-American War, Mexican-American War, where the U.S. gained all this territory in the South west, and as a result, it had to be decided, are they going to be slave or free? And because of a compromise that happened, that led to some states being allowed to enter as slaves, some as free, and that meant that the balance was maintained, and the Wilmot Proviso was never accepted. It meant that no new territories could adopt slavery, but it didn't go through. Transcontinental Railroad we already talked about, being across country and the Golden Spike and the Big Four. Manifest Destiny was the idea. Again, President McKinley is kind of the face to put with Manifest Destiny. It means the destiny of Americans was to move across toward the west to conquer the entire country, sea to shining sea. The Panama Canal was kind of the baby of Teddy Roosevelt. It was a great engineering feat, but it was also an example of imperialism and colonialism, because the United States basically took over that canal zone to keep it safe, but also to exert power. Controlling the canal meant controlling all the traffic through the canal. The Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s came about because of people like Denis Kearney and this idea that somehow the Chinese were threatening American jobs. And it was a long time before Chinese people then were allowed to come into the country as legal immigrants. Internment camps it's more racist residue in our country. In World War II, FDR gave the declaration that all Japanese Americans had to be put in camps. And so we have Anforan, which was kind of a temporary camp. That's the racetrack nearby us that was used as a kind of a loading zone. And then Japanese Americans were sent then to places like Manzanar in Death Valley. Terrible climate. People did die in those camps. They weren't quite the same as concentration camps, but they are a terrible black mark on our history. We need to acknowledge it. Anti-Semitism, again, like Father Coughlin, it's against Jewish people. Any language, any actions against Jewish people. The white man's burden, that comes from Rudyard Kipling. His idea, especially in India, but Africa as well, the idea that white men somehow are better than people of other colors. And this is it's a terrible, heinous idea, but it was promoted within the culture at that time, that somehow Europeans and Americans had civilization to give everybody else. Partition is referring now to India, and the idea in 1947 that India would be divided between Hindus and Muslims. Indian National Army was basically during World War II. They were Indians who fought with the Japanese against the British in places like Burma, and they were put on trial after the war, and they were considered traitors. But Nehru actually defended them. So you need to understand it's very complicated when you think of the relationship between the British and the Indians, especially during World War II, because the Indian people had been betrayed so many times by false promises. The Radcliffe Line is that line of partition between Pakistan and India, and also the East Pakistan, which became Bangladesh. Ethnic cleansing is when you get rid of people who are different from you ethnically, and it's kind of a false idea. I mean, people, scientists have looked at genes and see that we are all the same. It's people who make these differences. And so ethnic cleansing it's just an awful euphemism. It means making something sound better than it really is. Terrible. It means genocide. Midnight's Children was a novel written by Salman Rushdie, a Muslim Indian who became famous because he wrote this book about partition and the children that were born at the magical moment with superpowers. Midnight of Independence Day, but the problem is they couldn't stop all the horrible things that happened after independence, including the partition and all the killings and burnings that happened. The Green Revolution started in Mexico, but right at the same time, profoundly influenced India because it gave people the ability to feed themselves. And so that's the Green Revolution, just designing seeds, rice in particular, that could produce high yields, much more rice. The genetically modified foods, that's what it is. You also have less, which is the yellow soil. It's all over the world in different places, in Germany or Eastern Europe, for example, but it's also in kind of the northern part of China along the Yellow River. That's why the Yellow River is yellow, because of the yellow soil. And it's very silt-like, it washes away, but it led to civilization being developed there too. monsoon and typhoon are two different things. Monsoon is climactic. Excuse me. Climactic is based on climax. Climatic is based on climate. Okay, those two words are hard to differentiate. Climatic changes that happen seasonally. So 6 months of one thing, 6 months of another thing, and that's what monsoons are. They're wind patterns. And typhoons are events. They're hurricanes, literally. It's just a different name for hurricanes. The 21 demands are a part of Chinese history and Japanese history because the Japanese, who had invaded Manchuria, they made demands on the Chinese, the weak Republic of China, saying that you must give up Manchuria. And it was just a way for Japan to exert its control, and it led, to a World War II. The May 4th movement then was a response to the 21 demands. May 4th movement was basically after World War I, the fact that China got nothing out of World War I, even though they fought with allies and supported them. Japan jumped into the war and got parts of China. And so the May 4th movement would eventually be remembered even by the communists today. It's remembered because of what foreigners had been doing to China. The KMT is the Kuomintang, the Kuomintang. That is the Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek's party, Sun Yat-sen's party, the ruling party. It is existing today in Taiwan, although they are no longer the controlling party. And that's only happened in the last 20 years that the KMT does not control Taiwan. So there is a true democracy in Taiwan, but the KMT is one of those parties today. It's a nationalist party, conservative in many ways, democratic today and initially, but anyway. Know that KMT and communists used to be fighting each other, and now it seems like they're actually together because the KMT in Taiwan wants to work with the communists in China to improve the economy. The Comintern was an international communist party that basically was spreading revolution all over the world, and Ho Chi Minh was involved in the Comintern. And even Chiang Kai-shek initially was recommended by the Comintern because they saw him as a revolutionary. But later he would massacre communists. The Huangpu or Whampoa Academy was where all these radical revolutionaries were trained. Officers were trained in the military, the Revolutionary Army, and this was in Canton area. First United Front was when the nationalists, the KMT, and the communists came together in China, and they fought against the warlords. And so the Northern Expedition was a movement from the southern government of Chiang Kai-shek north to fight the warlords, and it was successful. But then the KMT and the communists started fighting each other. The League of Nations, remember that was after World War I. It was because of Woodrow Wilson's ideas, the 14 points, but it didn't have success because the United States never became a part of the League of Nations, and it basically fell apart gradually. Now the United Nations today is hopefully different. The OSS is the precursor of the CIA. The OSS and the CIA, again, they're like spies all over the world. OSS actually worked together with Ho Chi Minh during World War II. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam is what Ho Chi Minh declared in 1945 after the Japanese left. He wanted democracy, but on his terms, and it was communism. The Republic of China was Sun Yat-sen's republic, democracy, but now it's in Taiwan. Vichy France was the puppet government of the Nazis when they took over France, and then that spread to Vietnam as well. So you had French people, but they were working basically for the Nazis. Coup d'etat means when the military takes over the government and displaces the government. The Potsdam Conference was an agreement. It was a conference in Potsdam near Berlin, and it was basically dividing up things, planning what would happen after Japan lost and the Nazis lost. And it meant that Chiang Kai-shek was given the responsibility of taking over North Vietnam temporarily. The 17th parallel then became the dividing line. This happened as a result of the war between the French trying to get back their colony and the Vietnamese communists, the Viet Minh, who were there. And finally, the 17th parallel divided North Vietnam from South Vietnam. The USS Missouri was the battleship where the end of World War II was signed the Japanese surrendered on board that battleship. The People's Army of Vietnam, anytime you have people's something, it's communist. And so the People's Army of Vietnam, PAVN, was run by General Giap. The domino theory was the idea that if one nation in Southeast Asia becomes communist, other nations will follow, and it will be like dominoes. Heart of Darkness, written by Joseph Conrad, showed basically the Belgian Congo and how terrible it was, but it was also a kind of racist look at Africans who couldn't take care of themselves. Quinine was a drug invented to set aside the effects of malaria, and it allowed Europeans to live in Africa and have colonies there. Jim Crow laws happened in the United States, and they were basically laws of segregation, like apartheid, and they separated people in the United States. So apartheid happened in the 1940s, about the same time period as Jim Crow laws. Apartheid was official policy by the Afrikaner government to separate people. And remember, the British had taken over, but you still had British and Afrikaners living in South Africa at that time. And the British Commonwealth is this empire after countries start gaining their independence. They remained connected to Britain even though they were independent. Events. The Constitutional Convention of 1787, we've already talked about the fact that that was difficult, and the Great Compromise happened because of that convention basically allowing the South to have representation for slaves, even though slaves couldn't vote. And we have our two houses of government as a result of the Constitution. King Philip's War, we've already discussed that terrible war 50 years after the Plymouth colony, and Philip was Massasoit's son. The Sooner Land Rush in 1889 happened in Oklahoma, and it was basically the last territory to be taken over because it had been Indian territory or Native American territory, and even that was given over to settlers, and those Native Americans had to move other places. Battle of Little Bighorn, that's where Custer lost, and Wounded Knee Massacre happened as a part of these Indian wars, and it's a terrible legacy. The U.S. Army basically massacring these Native Americans and women and children as well, even though some of the males maybe had guns, but the force used was not proportional. The Great Potato Famine happened in Ireland and brought Irish people to the United States as a massive wave of immigrants. The sinking of the Maine happened to start the Spanish-American War, and it seems like it was probably an accidental explosion, but again, the U.S. government and many corporations and people said, "Oh, it's the Spanish. They terrorism." That's what happened, but probably an accident. Direct Action Day happened in India because of what Jinnah declared. He said that, we need to rise up and have our own homeland for Muslims. But what ended up happening was violence instead of nonviolence, and the Great Calcutta Killing, where, Hindus killed Muslims, but then Muslims killed many Hindus. And that was that terrible incident. The Indo-Pakistani War of 1971 was the second war that happened, and just know that it resulted in East Pakistan becoming Bangladesh. The Manchurian Incident, we said, was Japanese kind of faking a terrorist attack, and it started World War II basically in China in 1931. The Shanghai Massacre was Chiang Kai-Shek killing communists in 1926, and he showed that he was not going to work with communists anymore, and he was consolidating his power. The Battle of Hanoi was the first battle of the First Indochina War, and General Giap was the general. Dien Bien Phu, just know that was a major battle that ended the First Indochina War, and basically showed that the French could not control Indochina anymore. But that would lead to the escalation of the Second Indochina War with the United States coming in. Operation Passage to Freedom happened when the country was divided, and after Dien Bien Phu, many Catholics and people went into exile in South Vietnam. They fled North Vietnam, went to South Vietnam, but this was not going to be a lasting thing, because those people who had been forced to leave their home, they would have been fighting to regain their homeland. Same thing kind of happened in China when people went to Taiwan and North Korea and South Korea. So it's parallel all over the world. The Congo Crisis, again, was a Cold War crisis between the Soviets and the United States. And it happened because Lumumba asked for help from the Soviets to put down other factions. And so that was a crisis that led to a dictatorship by Mobutu. Year of Africa, 1960, it led to all kinds of independence, success all over Africa. Many countries gained independence in that year. The Mau Mau uprising, we talked about Kenyatta being a part of this uprising, wanting traditional government and native African government, not British government. So it was the beginning of a revolution. The Great Trek was when Afrikaners moved inland away from the British, and eventually you'd have the Boer Wars, which we'll talk about. Ethiopian famine, 1983 to 1985, is just a result of mismanagement by a communist government and great outpouring of support from the world to help those starving people. Live Aid was organized by Bob Geldof and was just hundreds of rock bands that performed all over the world, especially London and Philadelphia, and it was pretty profound. Saved my life. The Rwandan Genocide, 1994, happened because of Hutus wanting to get revenge on Tutsis, and it was a massive genocide, hundreds of thousands of people. And then the Boer Wars, First and Second Boer Wars between the Afrikaners and the British government, and the British won, and so basically established control over South Africa. But that would change in 1994 when you had a truly representative democracy there in South Africa. Whew, all done. God bless you.